Hi, I'm Dr. Paula Redmond, a clinical psychologist, and you're listening to the When Work Hurts podcast. On this show, I want to explore the stories behind the statistics of the mental health crisis facing healthcare professionals today, and to provide hope for a way out through compassion, connection, and creativity. Join me as I talk to inspiring clinicians and thought leaders in healthcare about their unique insights and learn how we can support ourselves and each other when work hurts. We know that when work and life hurts, being able to talk about how we feel and have those feelings heard and validated can make a huge difference to how we navigate and survive trauma. For those working on the front line during the COVID pandemic, this has never been more important. In this week's episode, I spoke with Claire Goodwin-Fee, a psychotherapist who set up an organisation called Frontline 19 to respond to this need. I started by asking her to explain what Frontline 19 does.
We currently offer emotional support to the NHS and frontline workers. We started back in March of 2020, and it was a small idea I had while sitting on my sofa. And I'd back in 2018, the NHS had saved my dad's life, and he'd been in intensive care for a few weeks and he'd been in a coma. And so when the pandemic hit and the type of illnesses that people were having, obviously due with COVID being put into comas, I kept thinking back to these people that I knew in intensive care that we'd got to know pretty well. And so I just thought I wanted to do something. I felt quite incompetent. What can you do to help people and to kind of support them? And I knew they'd be hit pretty hard by the whole COVID pandemic. And so I thought I'd do a very small project. And I thought, if we can kind of I just thought it'd be me on my own, to be quite honest. If I could get a few friends, because I've been a psychotherapist for, I think, nearly 20 years now. And I thought if I get a few friends together, we can kind of match some doctors and nurses up to kind of some therapists, and that might help for a bit. And so, I thought we're 40 people maybe, or 50, sounds like quite a lot. And it kind of snowballed from there. In the first day, I did a little page on Facebook. I mean, now laughing back, I was very naive to it all, but I did a page on Facebook. I think it was called something like Support the NHS with COVID-19. And I put it up and I pressed the button. And within about half an hour, my phone was just going crazy with these pings going off. And 700 people in the first day alone said, we need support. And also, by the way, can we help? And I just thought, I've got to be careful not to swear today. I thought, oh, gosh and darn it, what the hell have I done? As you do. So basically it took off from there. And we've just done 100,000 counselling sessions that we've given away. So it's been very, very busy, and it's taken off in a way that I would never have anticipated it to do. That's kind of the background really. So at the moment we do one-to-one counselling for people that want it. We do up to a maximum of 12 sessions, but some people just want one session just to debrief and to offload. Others want to have a whole block of sessions, and we just offer that support to help them through what is a very, very difficult time.
And I know, because I have done some volunteering for Frontline 19, that part of what your offer is matching, qualified, well-trained clinicians who are volunteering their time with frontline staff, which I think is an important part of your offering.
It is. I think it had to be balanced. So I've done it on kind of a bit. We had nothing. We had literally no money. We haven't got a huge amount now, but we literally did everything on a shoestring. And when we first started matching, we had an exercise book and a pet, and we literally was just matching people up like that. And so I wanted to I'd love to be able to pay all of the therapists that give their time, even though quite a few of them, when I've had that discussion, they're like, we don't want pay, and that's not what it's about. So I came up with this idea of this bartering system, so that qualified professionals would give 1 hour of their week, and in return we would give them really good training, CPD opportunities, clinical supervision, support, templates for any kind of paperwork they might need, so contracts or agreements, all of that sort of thing. So, and a really supportive team, because when you join us as a volunteer, I think you're joining kind of like a family, really, because we're all doing the same thing and all wanting to kind of contribute to what has become a huge wave of positivity.
I've really enjoyed the work that I've done. It's been very rewarding. And I wondered, Claire, we're kind of, nearly 2 years into this experience. I know you said that you'd initially thought it would just be a few months. What themes have emerged in terms of why people, my frontline staff, are seeking the help?
I think part of something that I didn't really appreciate at the time was how underdeveloped, that's a polite way to put it, how underdeveloped the helping professions are in looking after themselves, but also in their levels of emotional literacy. And by that I mean is how do I feel, why do I feel this way, and what can I do? And they just don't ask for help, and there's a huge amount of taboo around asking for any kind of support with mental health, and that really surprised me. A common question, we don't get it too much now because I've been very vocal about the fact that if anyone contacts us, it's a confidential service. But at the early days, we used to get email after email of really interested in your service, but are you going to tell my boss that I'm in touch with you? And that was really quite surprising. And so some of the biggest themes have been about, it comes in waves really, a bit like the pandemic. At the start, it was anxiety, very extreme anxiety about what was to come. How dangerous was it going to be? Am I going to be okay? People have got children, husbands, wives, partners that, perhaps were vulnerable. Some people were shielding. There was all sorts of different things. But the main thread was about anxiety. And I guess we can all relate to that really, because I felt quite anxious at the start, thinking, like, how does this work? And I remember looking out of my front room window, it was about 3:00 in the morning, and seeing the lights of my neighbour, and they were doing the exact same. We were kind of almost like looking down the road. You expected to see kind of like this Sputnik thing come marching down the road, because this thing was kind of like taking over. And I think people could relate to that. So, and then it changed a bit and it got very quiet. And I was like, oh, maybe the work's done. Like maybe they're okay. And of course they weren't okay. They were just very busy in the hospitals and in the community, kind of, getting things sorted out and working with the patients, and kind of were under extreme pressures. And then when COVID numbers dropped a bit, we then got really busy again. And so it tends to follow up and down. And in saying that, it's been pretty solid, pretty busy, probably for at least the last 6-7 months. Things like post-traumatic stress disorder, we see that quite a lot, which is understandable. I mean, some of the conditions that people have worked within have literally been like battle zones, like a war zone. And so I think you need the mental space to unpack that really. And so that all the time you're busy, you might feel really tired and exhausted, but you tend not to perhaps get the sharper end of PTSD-like symptoms until there's a little bit more space. I mean, that's kind of like a generalisation, but... And then I think just recently, and this probably will come as no surprise to you, is burnout. It's the biggest thing, is burnout. We are seeing so many people leaving the professions, in healthcare, nurses, consultants, doctors, paramedics, community nurses, people that are really incredibly experienced, and they have just had enough. And that really worries me, because I think, what does that mean for the profession? What does that mean for the community? What does it mean for the NHS itself? So it's it's kind of, it comes in waves, but that's, I think, the current trend, if you like, at the moment, is about burnout and being emotionally exhausted. But again, I think that's also echoed outside of the healthcare professions too. I don't think anybody's okay at the moment, I guess is what I'm saying.
And it's interesting when you were talking about that sense of, when COVID numbers dropped, and that then saw a bit of a surge in people reaching out. And that was my experience too. And I think what I noticed in the work that I do also with doctors and nurses was that during that period, people were having and experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms. But because they were no longer in that context, they couldn't really make sense of it. Their nervous systems were still in a fight or flight state, but because in their heads they were past that and out of that phase, that disconnect was really worrying. They could make sense of the stress and the tension when they were in it, but they couldn't make sense of it when they were out of it. And I think that was something that was really helpful about having a space to talk with someone who understands trauma and understands the impact on our nervous systems, and just helping people to make sense of the fact that, our bodies keep the score, and, still needing to work through that stress and the trauma. And for many people not actually having the time and space to do that, it was the shift from, COVID numbers dropped, but then suddenly everything else was, business as usual almost from a health service point of view, which was very overwhelming.
I think so. And I think you're right. It's about kind of being in that moment and not really understanding what's happening. And there is a real, within the kind of healthcare community, there's a real lack of knowledge about prevention, about management, about resilience. And also, I think there's also a big, I don't know quite how to say it, but there's a huge issue with perfectionism. And, when you look at doctors and nurses, that there's this thing around, we know that health is important, that goes without saying. However, there's this massive thing about it has to be perfect. There's a perfection to it. And so even kind of some of the junior doctors put themselves under so much pressure, and the hours that they work and the way in which they work is very back in the dark ages. And I think that when you have a community of people that kind of all do the same thing because that's how it's always been done, that it becomes quite difficult to challenge that, particularly in times where you really got your back up against the wall. And I remember talking to a research scientist that had been moved onto a COVID ward, and is used to dealing with kind of research and being kind of not really at the kind of in the midst of having lots of patients and stuff around him. And so was on a ward, and their first job they were given, as they walked in, the sister gave them a huge pile of papers and said, there you go. And they were like, well, what, this is a list of names. Like, what is this? That's a list of all the people that have died, and you need to phone their relatives and tell them. And this person said, well, what do I say? And then the sister said, I don't give a shit what you say. Just go in that office, take the paper, the numbers are there, just tell them they've died of COVID, blah, blah, blah. And you think, oh my God, you monster. But being that person, how do you manage that? You have to, at some point, you're human, you shut down, you have to just do not the bare minimum, but emotionally you can't be present within that because it's way too damaging. And so they went into this room and started making the phone calls. And, some of these people, because at that stage, this was pretty early on, at that stage, it was we had no vaccine, and it was affecting people that were normally would be considered fit and healthy. And so you had 40-year-olds who had died, who had children, and this person's having to phone these people up. And when we did the Hopeline campaign, which is the campaign to leave messages for the NHS, to support, and you can phone in as an NHS and frontline worker and listen to those. And honestly, if you have a bad day, phone in and listen to them, because they are such lovely messages, and they're loving and supportive, and some of them are deeply moving. And I remember when we started doing the film for that, to advertise it, and they asked me about different case studies, and I said, you have to say about this, and we swapped it around a bit, but one of the first opening credits is about that particular story, and it's about having to make those phone calls and being emotionally not equipped to deal with that. I mean, it blows my mind that you have people who work in, I don't know, cancer or palliative care, that have never been given any training on telling someone that they're going to die. That blows my mind. Like, how is that even a thing? And you think to yourself, no wonder people are stressed before the pandemic. So if you put me in a situation where you want me to talk about something that I don't know, or do something that I've not been trained to do, the gap between what you believe your competency is and what is needed is huge. And there, in that space, sits a lot of stress.
Yeah. And especially, as you say, for people who tend to not only really care about doing a good job, but also have a layer of perfectionism around that, then that's a horrible place to be.
And it creates an untenable situation for everybody, because we have kind of these, I guess, unrealistic expectations of what medical professionals can do. And, there's a lot of pressure. I remember sitting with my dad, and every single day the team would say, he was in King's in London, and they were magnificent, and I have no doubt that if it wasn't for them, he wouldn't be here. And I remember every day one of them would sit with me and say, look, you do understand that your dad is very, very sick? And I said, no, I do understand that. And they said, well, that means that he may not survive this. And they were very good, because they gently kind of, it wasn't kind of doom and gloom, but they kind of had to keep it within reasonable parameters. And I'm sure they would be happy that they were, he's still here, and he's doing okay. But it's having those conversations and kind of having the boundaries with some of the families. That's been a very, very difficult thing for them. And also, it's just been on every level. It's been an assault on every level. So they don't know how to treat this new thing that's just appeared. They go to Battlestar, red light, whatever, or should I say, red light response. And they're working shoulder to shoulder with colleagues that are living in garages or hotels, so they can keep away from their families, because they don't want to pass this stuff on. They're losing colleagues to COVID. They're nursing them. Their paramedics might lose 1 or 2 people a week in their shift pattern. That's kind of, unfortunately, the nature of what they do. And they're losing 4 or 5 in a shift. And they're loading people back onto an ambulance, and they're dying on the trolley because they've left it too late, 'cause they're too frightened to go to hospital. And it's horrific. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what these people have been through. And then to get abuse for not doing X, Y, and Z, or people moaning about the length of time they're waiting. Of course, nobody wants to wait while they're uncomfortable or in pain, but these people are human beings and actually need lots of support, lots of care, and actually they need a space to be able to decompress. And this whole experience of the pandemic has been a bit like being poisoned. There's only so many people you can talk to about it. You can't really go home and, oh, how was your day, love? Yeah, I lost 60 people overnight. And we had to ring round mortuaries trying to find freezer space because we ran out. It's horrible. It's horrible stuff. And so it's been very heavy, I think, for a lot of people. I certainly will never be the same person that I was before. That's for sure. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. It just is what it is, really. And even if everything finished tomorrow, I don't regret doing what I've done, but it's certainly been hard. It's been difficult. And there's been a lot, if I think back to, this idea, this very naive idea about helping a few people, and how quickly it spread and how big it got, and the depth of need that's there. It's been a real journey.
And interesting to think, Claire, about, I guess, some parallel processes there around, you and your organisation supporting the frontline, who are holding so much for their patients and their colleagues, and the sense of, I guess, the behind the line support that maybe the psychological wellbeing workforce is trying to hold. How has that been for you? Kind of, what impact do you think that's had on you and the people that you work with in terms of holding that for clients?
I think that, I've reduced my own client. I had a private practice. I've got very reduced numbers now, because when this first happened, it was only meant to be little, and obviously it took off, and I've had to kind of cut back. I think that within our industry, I think that we are also at risk of burnout. I know that a lot of the recommendations is about having clinical supervision, which is, I always describe that to people that aren't aware of it. It's like this space between management and kind of therapy. It's like this little space that happens in between, where you can talk about your own stuff but in respect of kind of client work. I know that, we're expected to do it once a month for an hour and a half. I do it every 2 weeks, and that I found really helps, because that's my space to offload. And also, I think it was at the start of this year, I had some sessions with a psychologist, just to help me make sense of what I'd been through, not only in just a professional capacity, but also I'm a mum of 2 young children. They were out of school. My husband was at risk. I was at risk. I've got 2 parents. I was going to say are elderly, but if they hear this, they'd probably tell me off, but they're in their 70s. And so it's had an impact on us all. My life doesn't look anything like it did pre-pandemic. So I think that we are all, no one's okay. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but nobody's 100%, living their best life. Everybody's struggled or have been through something. And the reason I say that is not to be a Debbie Downer, but to kind of say that's very normal, and it's a natural response to what we've been through. And actually, the more you talk about it and you share it, the easier it becomes. And actually, other people are like, yeah, it is a bit rubbish, and I've really struggled with this and this. And it alleviates the pressure on you, but also you start to perhaps be kinder to yourself and expect less. We've all been in a marathon, and we're expecting to now do a sprint at the end of it. That's not possible. And I'm not as, I don't have the output that I used to have. Well, no, of course you're not going to. We've been running with this high level of stuff. It's like having too many tabs open on the computer. Am I going to get toilet roll? Are the kids going to be okay? Are my mum and dad going to be all right? Oh my gosh, we've got this chance of vaccine. Is it going to poison me? All of these things, having discussions with people and friends that perhaps don't feel the same way about the vaccine as you do. That's a thing of itself. Political considerations, losing the laissez-faire attitude about getting just a common cold. I miss who thought we'd ever say that. I miss the chance to go, oh, it's just a cold. Now it's like, hang on, have we done a PCR? And all this language, lockdown, PCR, lateral flow, all of this stuff that we've had to learn. There's so much ambiguous loss about the loss of what we could have had, what we should have had, what may have been, and then the normal losses, like normal things about taking a holiday. It makes me laugh now. We couldn't go away, but it never occurred to me to take a break from work because I wasn't going on holiday. And when you talk to people, other people are like, yeah, I did the same thing. Why didn't you just take a week off work and stay at home? Because it genuinely didn't occur to me.
And there's something about you used the term heavy, that this is heavy kind of load to carry. And one of the things I think that's been so difficult is that not only has the load been heavier, and, for some of us that's been greater than others, those on the front line or those who've had to deal with, financial uncertainty or illness or bereavement. Some of us have been lucky to not have to face those things so directly. But at the same time as the load being heavier, we haven't had access to the things that normally would help us lighten that load or share that load. We haven't been able to just hang out with people or, do fun things or see art, all those things that would help us manage and process that stress. So I think, a real double whammy there of heavier load and not able to relieve.
Definitely. And I think that, my learning since this all started, and it sounds very cliche, but it's honestly genuinely meant, it is the little things that matter. I now could not care less where I meet my friends. I could sit on a park bench and we could both have a packet of Wotsits and I wouldn't care. As long as we're together and we're chatting and I'm with that person, anything else is a bonus, and I genuinely mean that. And, I remember meeting a friend of mine. I don't live too far from Bluewater, the big shopping centre. Got loads of car parks. And we parked up next to each other, but had this space in between, had the windows down. She had her snacks. There's me sitting there with my little hummus and cucumber chatting away. And it was freezing cold, but it was magnificent because in that moment I was just with my friend. And although I couldn't touch her, and again, that's another interesting thing is about touch, because I'm quite a tactile person, and not being able to touch different people, like friends, and hugging them, that was a real kind of, if I look back now, it's quite a bereavement of sorts. I know that sounds a bit drastic, but when I lived in America years ago, because obviously I didn't know anybody there, people don't really, they're not that tactile. Well, they weren't where I was anyway. And I really remember really missing that, thinking, gosh, I've not touched anybody in 3 months, not even just like a hand on the nothing. And I remember during the pandemic kind of sitting watching TV and holding my husband's hand and saying, do you know what, it's really weird, I really miss touching people. And I even noticed people drove differently during lockdown. Now, as a carer for my mum and dad and being a frontline worker myself, I had to get out and about and do certain things and work. And the cars were actually keeping a distance away from each other. And everybody was trying to get where they needed to get in a hurry. But there was still this gap. And even I was doing it, you kind of stayed way back. And it was so ingrained into us at that point to keep away from people that I think a lot of people shut down and kind of really isolated themselves from other people. And I think that's had a massive impact on people too.
And I think, Claire, not just the absence of touch, but that touch became a threat. So the thing that was a source of comfort was actually a source of threat, to hug someone or to receive a hug.
People became unsafe, didn't they?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And even the silly thing, just before lockdown, I've got asthma. And I went in, it was cold, and I went inside a building. And so from going to cold to hot, it makes me cough. Oh my days, this lady launched herself at me and was like, you got, and I was like, whoa. And I kind of held up my Ventolin whilst I was gasping for breath and went, I've got asthma. But she was not happy. And I said, I haven't got a cough watch. So I used it. I said, look, there's nothing there now. And she was like, okay. But that kind of dealing with other people's fear levels. I mean, yourself, you're in a supermarket, you hear someone cough and you can't help but go, is that a normal cough or is that something else? This is why I say nobody's okay. Because I think normally, if I'd have felt some of the things I'd felt during the pandemic, I never would have worked. And also, previously, if you were going through something, then you'd be like, actually, I'm going to take some time out, and you'd pass your clients on to someone else, or you'd go, I'm taking a bit of time out. Everybody was going through stuff. And what I found very difficult was when I was working with my clients and they would talk about something pandemic related, and I could really feel myself responding to that. And kind of a couple of times was quite triggered, and I had somebody that was not a fan of vaccines, and it was very difficult because emotionally, normally, of course, you do emotionally respond to things in therapy sessions, but this felt really raw, almost as if I'd had a bereavement, was working with a bereavement client, which we know would never be an ethical thing to do, not in that moment, not when it was so raw. And it was just so odd thinking everybody's going through stuff all at the same time.
Like a collective trauma, isn't it?
I mean, I sometimes sit and I think about how society will change because of this situation, and I am in no doubts it will. And I'm hopeful that some of it will be positive. So I'd like to think that people perhaps appreciate each other more. I'd like to think that. But I also see at the moment a lot of anger, a lot of hurt, a lot of people looking for somebody to be angry at, whether that be people that haven't had a vaccine or the government or whoever it is. They're very angry about what they've been through. We've all sustained loss. We've all had some level of trauma of some degree, whether it's mild, moderate or significant. And I think that I used to think about, in the early days of the pandemic, I used to think about my grandparents who went through the Second World War. And I used to, and there were times thinking, I just can't do this. I was at home with a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, my husband, 2 dogs, parents that needed support, couldn't go out shopping. So it felt like a lot. And I was working and living in the same space. And that of itself taught me a lot. And I just thought, I don't think I can do this. And I used to sit and think, yeah, but hang on a minute, Claire, look, your grandparents were bombed. They used to go to sleep in the underground because their house was unsafe, or they'd be in an air raid shelter and they didn't have enough food to eat. They were on rationing and all of that stuff. So, you know what, you can get through this, and you just have got to do what you can when you can and just look after yourself in the best way that you can. And so I kept thinking back to, at some point COVID's got to become something where it's a treatable, manageable thing. And I just kept thinking I have to keep the faith that we're going to get to that point. And so I think that what's really interesting is that I personally used previous history and experiences to help me in the here and now to manage what I found quite a difficult, challenging situation.
And do you think that potentially one of the positive things to come out of this is to highlight the emotional impact of work on healthcare professionals and the need for psychological support for the health service?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, that's a big part of my reason, my why, is because people in the healthcare professions, hospitals, community, paramedics, and frontline staff full stop, police, fire, their support is, sometimes it just is not there. And at other times there is a basic support system there, but is it effective? No, it's not. And it needs to be. We're expecting so much of this collective of people, and yet, I spoke to somebody the other day that said, my trust does have emotional support. I said, that's amazing. Yeah, but the wait is 3 years. And this person was at the extent where they were actually feeling suicidal because they were so emotionally exhausted by what they'd been through. And we know physically and mentally they're both enmeshed. I mean, at the start of this you mentioned about the body knows the score. Well, Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the world leaders in trauma, he talks about that connection all the time, and it absolutely is there. When you're a bit run down, the first thing that goes for me is my throat gets a little bit croaky, and it kind of, our bodies are a mirror about our mental health and vice versa. And so what needs to happen is it needs to change for future generations. It needs to change for the paramedic that's just started their training. It needs to be something where people's mental health is honoured across the board, whether that be in corporate, private, public sector. Work-life balance needs to be much more considered. And I think in the healthcare professions, this toxic perfectionism, which is rife, is absolutely rife. And this blame culture of, okay, something's wrong, who can we blame? It has to stop, because we're going to get to a stage where people are not going to want to work in this community. And you know what, it's a rough deal. People, they get paid this money. My doctor phoned me at 9 o'clock the other night, 9 p.m, to talk about a standard thing, that I needed some support with. And I said to her, have you got many more people to see? She said, yeah, I have. I've got about another 2 or 3. And I said, is it normal that you're working to this extent? She went, yeah. And this lady has young children of her own. One of them's definitely, I think, 4, and works part-time. And part-time consists of working 2.5 days a week until 9-10 o'clock at night. That's not part-time. And then to read about your profession in the newspaper as being incompetent, lazy, and all that stuff. So, yes, I think there needs to be training in every form of healthcare profession. If you sign up to learn, if you're going to do a degree in nursing, you need to do a section, even if it's 2 days, on mental health for you, for your colleagues, and also for your patients. If you are going to train to be a doctor, same thing. And I also think they need to make CPD, continual professional development, they need to make that 1 day a year to do with mental health. Because if you've got a doctor that is struggling to tell somebody that they've got a life-limiting condition or they're terminal, they're going to go one of 2 ways. They're either going to burn out, or they're going to turn into this very robotic, kind of detached person who, for the patient and their family, it's going to be difficult to be around. And it actually has an impact on the care that's given within that space. But also, as a human being, we just need to know that everybody has ups and downs. Everyone has good and bad days, and that, perfectionism, it just doesn't exist. All perfectionism does is robs today of your joy. Good enough is good enough. I mean, Winnicott did this whole thing about being a good enough mum. And, mum guilt is a huge thing. And a lot of women in healthcare are mums. And they're trying to manage home life, being a mum, with having a career and everything else. And it's really bloody tough. And so we need to have these conversations about, one, it needs to be at the start of the career, it needs to be in the middle, and it needs to be at the end. But also, I think just generally as a society, we need to just start talking about how we're feeling. It is utterly ridiculous to me that people say things like, oh, don't cry, you're upset yourself. Hello, newsflash, if I wasn't upset, I wouldn't be bloody crying. And also, you wouldn't say to somebody, don't go to the toilet because you'll be really weak. Pardon? But people say this all the time, oh, don't get upset, you don't get upset, you'll be weak, or people think I'm weak if I do X, Y, and Z, or if I get upset. It's a very natural, normal response. If I poke you in the eye, it's going to water. If you're upset, you may cry. That's totally standard. So do you know what? Let's stop playing this bullshit game about we shouldn't do this or we should do that, and how's this going to look to other people? Just stop. Let's just start having these conversations with each other and listening to each other.
And just on that note, you've talked about some of the things that you have in place to support you in the work in terms of professional support. But what are the other things that keep you going in this work?
Something I'm passionate about, and I'm doing a naughty smile because it brings out my inner child, is adults need to be kids. They need to play. Who made up the rule that we don't get to play anymore? That's a rubbish rule. So I decided that wasn't cool. That was being chucked out. So, I'll do things like, I'm lucky I've got 2 little kids, I have that as an excuse, but do you know what, I'd do it anyway. I might, in the morning, I put on music and I dance around to it if I'm feeling low. Self-care for me is not about, I don't do face masks or stuff like that, but I do singing very badly to Michael Bublé, or I might do kind of hideous dancing around the front room.
What are your favourite tunes to dance to?
I like Christmas all year round, I have to be honest. And I got married in May and I had Christmas songs at my wedding. And everyone went, this is... I said, yeah, I do, and I don't care. Anything and everything, from Stevie Wonder to the Pogues to everything in between. I love reading. Again, people expect me to be reading, I don't know, the history of Jung or Freud. And no, at the moment I'm reading Millie Johnson book, which is an absolute chick flick type book. I'm a huge fan of Harry Potter. Any of that stuff. Disney, I love a bit of Disney. I just think, you know what? Do what makes you happy and have fun with it. You haven't got to be serious all the time. But I think self-care looks like having fun, enjoying yourself. Have a bubble bath for 4 hours. If you can get away with it, please do it for my sake, if nothing else. But top the water up, take books in there, take snacks in there, have fun, dance around the front room. I mean, I've got a puppy, she's coming up to a year now, who is an absolute, she's bonkers, but I adore her. And I know you've got a dog too. I mean, taking her for a walk, she makes me get out, because if she doesn't, she sits and literally puts her head on the computer saying, Mum, come on, we need to go out. But all of those things, I think it's about just do things that make you happy. Don't worry about what other people think. If it makes you happy and it's not harmful, do that, and then do some more of it.
So it sounds like for you there's something about connection to your playful side, something about movement.
I'm open to any of it.
Yeah, and keeping it, yeah. And I think that's one of the things, isn't it, that we need to remember, that when we are stressed and when things are weighing heavy on us, that we have a tendency to shut down, to withdraw, and to drop some of these things. Whereas if we can enable and allow ourselves to open up.
Even asking for help, and I know that that's difficult in the helping professions, just asking for some help. And I had to learn how to do that, and it's not easy, but asking for help. And just, if somebody opens up to you, because very often we focus on it's good to talk and all of that stuff, but then it's like, then what? Because we've just said there's not the resources there. So tips, if someone opens up to you and says they're having a rubbish time, don't try and fix it. It's really simple. Just listen and say, I'm really sorry.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to find out more about Frontline 19 and the support they offer, go to frontline19.com. And if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please do share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. I'd really love to connect with you, so do come and find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. And you can also sign up to my mailing list to keep up to date with future episodes and get useful psychology advice and tips straight to your inbox. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks again, and until next time, take good care.